ideally, this would be the starting point for a process in which we, as scholars, civil society, civil servants, diplomats, and so on, would start thinking about how, ideally, a peace plan between the Ukraine and Russia would look like. Yeah? Looking also at the students in the room here, I'd be very happy about your input about this and for thinking about a time frame of something like 6 months or so. Yeah? So that ideally we would have actually then a document in hand. Why actually something like a peace plan? Because you could fault us probably for being very naive. Yeah? For the time being, the war is still raging. So the parties may not stop anytime soon. They may at some stage stop, but there may be no peace agreement. So it could simply be yet another frozen conflict or a cold peace, however you want to call it. They may stop fighting and there may be a peace agreement, but the peace agreement simply reflects power politics, say the military situation on the ground. But we think that nevertheless, although there are all these dangers, it is high time to think about how something Mona called it a just peace, ending an unjust war, how that could look like, what would be the ingredients for that. If we look at international law, if we look at the UN system, also if we look at political theory, what kind of principles, what kind of established practices are there to think of a peace agreement? And I'm very happy today to welcome 3 fantastic panelists who are going to discuss that. And I'm going to quickly introduce you to them. Then I'm going to give them the word for something like 8 to 10 minutes. We'll then discuss a little bit amongst the 4 of us, and then I'm going to open up for debate. And the debate is really something that's very important for us. So I'm going to start with Franz Baumann, sitting to my right. He's former Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations. He's also a visiting research professor at New York University, a senior fellow at the Hertie School in Berlin. And he is also vice president of the Academic Council on the United Nations System. And this is basically where we got to know one another because Franz tries to re-establish and make it strong again, the ACUNS branch here in Vienna. To my left is Mona Ali Khalil. She is a public international lawyer, has 25 years of UN experience, also other places, international organizations, for instance, as a senior legal officer in the United Nations and in the International Atomic Energy Agency. So she'll definitely bring a lot of expertise on international law in here, which obviously for this endeavor is very important. She's the founder and the director of MAC Law International, which is a consulting service that advises governments and international organizations, as they put it, in the service of we, the peoples. That obviously rings a bell in terms of the UN Charter. And then I also have the pleasure to welcome John Dunn. On the left, he is Professor Emeritus in political theory at King's College in Cambridge. And highly accomplished scholar. I probably don't have to say too much about it. So when I was a master's student, some of you are master's students, then I worked on internal conflicts in Africa, and one of the books that I came across was obviously his book on revolutions, which is a really fantastic one. Obviously, also lots of other very well-known works. The Cunning of Unreason is something I can recommend to anyone. So it's about reason and politics and to what extent it comes together or to what extent it doesn't. So please join me in welcoming our 3 panelists. And then without any further ado, Franz, I'm going to hand
Yeah,
you.
danke, Markus. Thank you very much for organizing this event and for being so receptive, and of course for the Diplomatic Academy too. So we talked a few weeks ago in connection with an initiative of former UN officials writing a letter to the Secretary General asking him to get involved a little bit more proactively in Russia's aggression against the Ukraine. Because under Article 99 of the Charter, the Secretary General has responsibilities and power, and he could come forward with ideas. And so it was a cri de coeur on behalf of some former United Nations staff, if you will, to defend the honor of the organization, because the Secretary General, in our view, was rather passive. So, discussing this with Markus, he wastes no time. He said, let's do something about it. And so here we are. And I'm very grateful for his proactiveness and for getting us all together. And also, of course, getting my friend and colleague Mona Khalil. We work together both here in Vienna, but also in New York. Getting her also involved because she's a profound expert on international law, having worked in the Office of Legal Affairs, and I guess having more than once held the feet of Secretaries General to the fire of international law, what has to be done. But anyway, so she will speak for herself. So the idea was, what could a peace plan put forward by the UN Secretary General, what would it look like? Now, I am not going to talk about this because I actually don't know. That would be a process, a deliberative process. But as a political scientist and somebody working in international relations and having worked at the UN for a while, I put together some thoughts on the context. So let me start out by saying that I think that on 24th February this year, actually, the 21st century began. The previous 2 decades or so were still drunk on the illusions of 1989, the end of history, and so now we are in hangover time. Russia's war will determine what the world will look like in the next 20 years, maybe actually the next millennia. And I say this because if the world does not come together to fix climate change, the decarbonization of the atmosphere of the world economy, tipping points will be crossed, irreversible ones. So the dangers of what is going on in Ukraine and the huge suffering goes far beyond. It actually affects international governance. And I think it has to be reflected. The UN was founded on the principle of compromise, that strong countries do not throw their weight around. And so this fundamental idea is also that pacta sunt servanda, if you have an agreement, you stick to it. So many of the core tenets of the United Nations have been shredded in the last couple of weeks. Of course, they were never sacrosanct, but they have never been as damaged as they have been in the past couple of months, weeks. So, what are the chances of Russia becoming a normal country? What are the chances that it will not remain a revisionist, aggrieved, resentful country? So I'm speaking as a German citizen, cognizant of my own country's fateful history. In 1918-19, there was the horrendous phrase of undefeated in the field. The German army undefeated in the field. It was stabbed in the back by the socialists and the Jews and whatever. So that planted the seeds for World War II, undefeated in the field. It was arguably more dangerous than the Treaty of Versailles. It was the completely unrealistic notion that had the German army not been stabbed in the back, it would have actually prevailed, which was not true. But that was the myth on which Nazism was built. Unconditional surrender, capitulation, a radical, absolute, total break with the past. This is what happened in 1945, and it was a prerequisite for a democratic, prosperous Federal Republic of Germany, arguably, of course, in connection with the Marshall Plan and integration into the West. But the pulling out the roots, that Nazism was simply defeated, demolished, discredited, that allowed a new country to emerge. And I think that is what is required in Russia. Whether it will come about or not, I do not know. So when I hear people, sometimes my chancellor, the French president, or Henry Kissinger, or other voices that argue against humiliating Russia in the interest of averting an isolated Russian leadership to lash out in desperation, I am not convinced. I actually think that in psychology or in history, such caution is probably misplaced. I think that Putin and his enablers, they are the authors of Ukraine's suffering, of the global food crisis, and actually also of Russia's ruin. So whatever the West does or does not do, Putin's regime possesses sophisticated tools to propagate myths blaming others for its own failures. So to accommodate them by saying we will not humiliate you, I don't think is successful. For me, reducing revanchist grandiosity is a necessary element of an enduring settlement. So what are the other elements? I have thought of four that a peace plan must take into account. The first one is, of course, to reflect why is the war being fought. Secondly, how is the war going? Which side is closer to realizing its objectives? And is the situation on the battlefield dynamic or stalemated? Thirdly, what resources both sides have at their disposal? And fourth, what are the possible off-ramps? What is the war being fought? What are Russia's objectives? What are Ukraine's objectives? So Russia's objectives, in my view, are overthrowing the Zelensky government, occupying all of Ukraine, or at least the eastern part, reducing Ukraine to a client status, much like Belarus, or even reincorporating it into what would be effectively be a re-established Russian empire. So for me as a German, Heim ins Reich has a particular resonance, but that's what it is. Ensuring Ukraine's neutrality, in other words, not allowing membership, certainly not in NATO. And then there are some more absurd claims about denazifying Ukraine, or that NATO was encroaching or threatening a country of 11 time zones, that Lithuania was going to attack Russia. I think it's particularly absurd. I wouldn't want to go there even. But I also think beyond those, there are considerations that Putin might have felt threatened by a close neighbor moving west, introducing rule of law principles, creating a market economy, instituting political accountability. A politically, economically, socially successful neighbor might give funny ideas to people in St. Petersburg or in Moscow, and he certainly did not want that. Now, what are the Ukrainian objectives? Ukraine would like, I think, independence, be free to form a government as decided by the people, to restore sovereignty within the territory. We can argue whether that is pre-24 February or prior to 2014, but re-establishing territorial integrity. And then I think Ukraine would like to obtain reparations and reconstruction aid. And then it would like to have the freedom to join the European Union and possibly NATO. I personally cannot see Ukraine joining NATO in the next decades. Not because Ukraine doesn't want to, but because NATO would not admit it. And this was never on the cards. 2008, Angela Merkel, Sarkozy made it very clear, whatever the Americans were saying, Ukraine could not become part of NATO. And so that was never a realistic prospect. And to say that Ukraine was becoming NATO is absolutely unrealistic. So, in addition, I think for both Ukraine and for Russia, there are intangible objects. Justice, dignity, humiliation, reputation, retribution, and vindication. So these objectives are not static, they evolve. In this war, as in so many in the past, it is not only the objectives that shape the battles, but also the battles that shape the objectives. With Ukraine having defied battlefield expectations and held out against one of the most powerful armies in the world for now close to 100 days, nothing is impossible. This, by the way, for me is another clue. Nothing is impossible. You may remember in 2019, Volodymyr Zelensky ran a campaign against the oligarchs as an actor under the motto, nothing is impossible. And he won, and when he was elected, he said, you see, he won 73%, nothing is impossible. And I think that strikes terror in the heart of Putin. Nothing is impossible. If people in Russia realize that nothing is impossible, then his whole thing might crumble. So, it's clear in my view that Ukraine, having fought so heroically, has to decide, without outside interference, what it wishes to accomplish. Ukraine is bearing the burdens of blood and sacrifice on a scale not yet seen since World War II, and its cause is indisputably just. It has every right to decide what it can and cannot accept and strive for. Let me quickly run to the resources. I think I'm taking too much time now.
A bit, but it's okay.
Okay. All right. So, what the West is making available to Ukraine in terms of financial support and armaments and intelligence, and if it arrives fast enough, is of course a hugely important factor in addition to the heroism of the Ukrainians fighting. So, what about Russian resources? Before Russia invaded, it was by no means certain that there would be a united response from the West. The sanctions imposed on Russia after invading Crimea and Donbass were fairly limited. My own country, shamelessly, even in December 2015, a year and a half after the invasion, went forward with Nord Stream 2 pipeline, calling it a purely economic project, which it never was, circumventing, of course, Ukraine and Poland, and that was the whole thing. But now, much of the West, the US, Canada, European Union, are united in applying severe sanctions against Russian banks, companies, and oligarchs. However, I looked at the Bank of Russia's balance of payment data January to April, and they show that the sanctions are not working. At least not in the way they were intended. Russia's current account surplus, that means exports minus imports, jumped to an all-time high to $96 billion. This is 4 times more than it was last year. The total balance of goods and services show even a wider gap, 106 billion. At this rate, Russia's account surplus will hit 250 billion by the end of the year. So the extra amount being banked by Russia is actually more than all the assets frozen. So Russia is not exporting more oil and gas, but because of its war, the price has doubled. So it's making more money for selling less. And yes, Russia will suffer a bit once the stockpiles of Western goods and components are used up, and they will lay off some workers. But generally, while the war is not going well militarily for Russia, it's going very well economically. And so to think that Russia is going to collapse economically, I don't think so. Not as long as we continue buying as long as the world is addicted to fossil fuels. And even China will not come much to the help of the West. And as you know, not a single African country, for example, supports sanctions. So our view is a bit, let me call it a bit slanted. Now, my last point about the off-ramps. Everybody's talking, not everybody, some people are saying we have to give Putin an off-ramp. He has to save his face and move off. Now, that presupposes that he wants to get off his ramp. I don't think he does. I think as long as they prevail militarily on the battlefield, there is no chance that he would take any mediation, any off-ramp, anything. No, nor would Ukraine. In political science, there's a concept of ripeness. A crisis has to be ripe. So the Normandy landings of 44 could not have happened in 41. The time was ripe in 1944, and I do not know when the time will be ripe in Ukraine. It is not yet ripe. And both sides signal it's too early for negotiations. And then, of course, Churchill comes to mind, who said, "You cannot reason with a tiger if your head is in its mouth." And that is very much the situation of Ukraine. And so they don't want to negotiate. And they invoke another beautiful saying by Churchill, and this is, one does not negotiate with dictators. One defeats them. Both of these, the tiger metaphor and the defeat, he used vis-à-vis Hitler in 1940. So, yes, the European Union, Germany, France, Italy are very eager to have this thing stop. It costs a lot of money, it disrupts us, and so we would rather Ukraine make a few compromises and so on, without even thinking whether Russia wants any compromises. So, lastly, I find implausible that Russia attacked Ukraine. No, sorry. I find plausible that Russia attacked Ukraine in 22 because after its 2014 invasion, Putin thought he would get away with it. Secondly, Putin's Russia is not an ordinary country seeking some rational regional security guarantees. It is a predator that works according to its own logic. Russia, as it is today, will not be a normal country, and there is not any going back to normal. It will have to change internally before being a threat. And now my last point, and that's discouraging, external sanctions do not work. The academic literature actually shows through history that sanctions strengthen the regimes and delay democratization. There's not an argument for lifting the sanctions. It's just saying in history sanctions have not actually had the intended consequences. So where that leaves us with the peace plan, we have to listen to Mona. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Yeah, so Franz highlighted that the context is not all that easy, but Mona, maybe nevertheless, let's think about the peace plan.
Thank you, Markus. And, yes.
Yeah.
Working, I hope? Okay. Thank you, Markus. It's my first time being back in person at the Diplomatic Academy, so I'm very, very honored to be back and grateful for the invitation. And I want to also thank Mr. Baumann for not only introducing the concept of this event, but also inviting me to, first of all, have that discussion several weeks ago that led both to the article as well as to my participation today. So thank you both. Having thanked you, I'm now going to disagree with you, because I think 6 months for a peace plan is potentially disastrous. So on top of being naive, I'm going to add optimistic to my list of adjectives, and I think we need to move much faster. The people of Ukraine, in the first instance, who are suffering, the civilians of Ukraine in particular, cannot wait 6 more months of devastation. The people of the world, who are now very urgently facing a global food crisis, potentially a global shortage of fuel, as well as the potential for escalation across and beyond Ukraine on the military level, demands that we act quicker. Now, it's not necessarily our job to do that. There are leaders and there are secretary generals and there are people whose job it is to do that, and we should not give them a 6-month window to come up with a peace plan. They need to act urgently. They need to act compassionately, because those who are suffering on the ground, and that includes people in the Russian Federation as well, who do not like the policies of their government, who are feeling some kind of economic impact and certainly some reputational impact. So we need to give a sense of urgency to the need for an off-ramp, as Franz rightfully calls it, but a need to ensure that the violence stops, especially the violence against civilians. Now, you're absolutely right that a ceasefire or a cessation of hostilities is definitely different from a peace plan. So most urgently, we need a stop to the violations against civilian life. A cessation of hostilities altogether would be great, and then room to create a peace table for peace elements to be put on the table. And I have a few to share with you today. But with regard to the political context, I want to say that it wasn't Putin's war of choice in Ukraine, but Bush's war of choice in Iraq. That was the original breaking point of the system that was built post-World War II to protect us from the scourge of war. And it's the lack of accountability for that war, coupled with the lack of accountability for Crimea, that made it possible for Putin to think he can get away with it in 2022. So we cannot talk about accountability. We cannot talk about fixing the multilateral system. We cannot talk about restoring the credibility of the UN Charter and the promises of the UN Charter until we acknowledge the equality of the violation of the prohibition against the use of force against the territorial integrity of another state, unless we equally acknowledge the aggression in Ukraine, the aggression in Crimea, and now the aggression in Ukraine again. Sorry, in Iraq, and then in Crimea, then in the full country. George Bush himself, albeit labeled as a slip of the tongue, was actually an unforced confession of his own war crimes. The US war of aggression, the war crimes committed in Baghdad, as well as other parts of Iraq and Abu Ghraib, do not pale in comparison to the crimes being committed today. They are quite as shocking to the conscience of mankind as what we're seeing on our television screens today. Equally offensive. I'm not saying they're less offensive or more offensive, but equally offensive. So that prohibition has to be restored. The responsibility of the permanent members and the elected members of the council has to be resurrected. It's not power, it's responsibility that they're given. And when they violate that responsibility, when they become the violators, we have to hold them accountable. We, the membership of the UN, we, civil society, we, the international community. The US and the UK are unfortunately in this instance not the best advocates for peace or justice or accountability given their own crimes in Iraq. As part of a broader community, international community, they are welcome to join in that call if they recognize that they've contributed to the state of lawlessness that we have. Because that compromise that you rightly referred to is a compromise between the principles of power, which recognized the 5 superpowers at the time, with the power of principles. And that is what is eroding, and that is what makes it possible for Putin to think he can get away with this. When we show no respect for the law, that there will be no accountability, no consequences for such grave violations of the law, then we make it possible for those violations to continue. So we have to take the law seriously in order for them to take it seriously. Putin is not Russia. Russia is not Putin. If we're going to have an off-ramp for the country and people of Russia, we need to distinguish those two things. And if we're going to give recognition for the underlying root causes, we need to recognize that there were mistakes made, that there were issues raised that need to be addressed equally, impartially, independently, without rewarding the aggression, because those who advocate, like Kissinger has, that giving up land is a way towards peace are absolutely wrong. It's only a recipe for further aggression, further encroachment. The principles have to be respected. Accountability has to be had, and then we can have a sustainable peace that makes sense as a response to this aggression. So what are the elements of that? Without further ado, I think at a minimum, in an ideal world, and we're far from an ideal world, the Security Council can adopt a resolution under Chapter 6 that advocates for the peace process that it advocated for in its presidential statement. It should echo what the GA has done, what the International Court of Justice has done, is call upon the Russian Federation to pull back its troops, to lead to an immediate, voluntary, complete, and unconditional withdrawal of foreign forces. If possible, you can have a peacekeeping mission there to monitor the violations of both sides, if any, and to monitor the withdrawal of the foreign forces. That force will be there to ensure any ethnic minorities are protected. This can all be done under Chapter 6, and under Chapter 6 of the Charter, a party to a dispute, whether elected or permanent, shall not vote. Therefore, and it's shall not vote, not should not vote, shall not vote, and therefore Russia should not be allowed to vote on a resolution of that kind. If so, we can pass such a resolution. If it does, as many, including every single permanent member, proceed to veto it, then we go to the General Assembly, which has already convened under the Uniting for Peace, twice already met, already condemned the aggression, already upheld the territorial integrity of Iraq, already called for an immediate withdrawal, and has nonetheless not specified any measures to bring that into reality, merely a call and a condemnation. So what can now the General Assembly do? There are precedents, very strong precedents, on what the GA has done under emergency special sessions under the Uniting for Peace, and that includes everything from setting up a peacekeeping force, which they did in 1956. They have also called upon the former Soviet Union to withdraw from Hungary when they invaded in 1958, from Afghanistan in 1980. They've used the emergency special session to call upon the French and the UK to withdraw from Egypt prior to setting up the peacekeeping mission, to call upon the US and the UK from withdrawing from Lebanon and Jordan, respectively, calling upon Israel from withdrawing from occupied Arab and Palestinian territory. They've set up an arms embargo in the Congo. They've used the emergency special session to encourage and recommend the provision of military assistance, both to states as well as to national liberation movements. So they've done rather robust measures under this Uniting for Peace that they can now use here, not for condemnation, but rather to create an incentive for that off-ramp that Franz is talking about, an incentive to go to the peace table, that you may have more to win at the peace table than we have winning on the ground. Because a war that Ukraine does not lose, because it's the smaller party, it has won. And a war that Russia has not won, it has lost. And in modern warfare, there is no winning. There is no winning. Nobody's going to win this war. We're all going to lose. We're all losing as we speak, most of all the Ukrainian people. So we need to incentivize a peace plan. How does the General Assembly do that? First, we have to have a vision of what the peace plan looks like. It's not for me as the lawyer to talk about issues of neutrality, issues of non-aggression pacts, but those should be part of the mix. But ultimately, any peace plan has to be agreed to by the parties, by the Russians and the Ukrainians. So they do have a voice, but Russia as the people of Russia, we should not conflate Russia with President Putin, who is clearly not acting in his country's best interest, but rather for whatever his personal delusions may be. So in my view, the rule of law requires several elements. A peacekeeping mission to monitor violations of human rights and humanitarian law, as well as of the ceasefire that hopefully will take place. A compensation commission. Just like Iraq had to pay the damage that it caused in Kuwait, Russia should pay for the civilian damage it's causing in Ukraine. And the more damage it's caused, the more liability it will have. The accountability mechanism should also predate the aggression. The OHCHR and the OSCE have documented multiple human rights violations by both sides in the Donbass region in the period leading up to the February 24 aggression. Those need accountability too. The crimes committed after February 24, a separate accountability mechanism to deal with war crimes. The predominant number of war crimes being committed by the Russian soldiers, but there are crimes being committed by Ukrainian soldiers against prisoners of war. Of course, these are all allegations, but those too need to be investigated. A just war requires accountability for all crimes. Now, to the extent that there is questions concerning self-determination, which is equally an important part of the Charter, then one possible element is an internationally supervised, independently run referenda in the areas in question, whether it's Crimea and or the Donbas region. These are elements of a peace plan, only would go forward if both parties agree. These can be put forward by the Secretary General, either to the parties directly, to the General Assembly, or to the Security Council. In the meantime, to lay the groundwork for that, the General Assembly can, as it has done in the past, and I conclude with this, it can set up a registry of damage, as it did for the wall in Israel, to document the damage to civilian property and civilian lives in Ukraine, so that one day, whether it's national prosecution in Russia, national prosecution in Ukraine, and or international prosecution, that the facts are preserved, the forensic evidence is preserved, the testimony is preserved. We can also have accountability mechanisms to collect evidence, to ensure witness protection, to ensure that those who are involved in any future prosecution are given the tools to be able to tell their story without undue intimidation or other means. We can ensure that humanitarian assistance and relevant military assistance is being provided in the interest of individual and collective self-defense, and we can call upon member states to mitigate against the risks of nuclear conflagration and the global famine crisis. So all of this can be done if the Council is stopped from doing so by virtue of veto, whether under Chapter 6 or under Chapter 7. The General Assembly can step up, the Secretary General can step up. They're empowered by the Charter, they're empowered by long-standing resolutions, and we do have a say in the matter. Or at least we can. Thank you.
Yeah, Mona, thanks a lot. I mean, there was a lot of substance in there, and there was also very interesting points about procedure there. Yeah, about substance, you could almost see that some key principles for a peace agreement. So you mentioned reparations, reconstruction, non-aggression, neutrality, and in terms of process, there was basically a plea to not only look at the Security Council, which we probably all too often do, but also at the Secretary General and the General Assembly. I think those are all points that we can then deepen in the discussion. And John, can I give the word to you?
Thank you very much. I should say that I'm speaking as a visiting fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences, because we're all told to say that always if you speak in public. And I should also say, which is, I wasn't told by the Institute, that actually I'm a very partisan speaker on this subject, because I'm married to someone who was born in Odessa and has her second home there, and who was there with our 4-year-old daughter late in January this year. So this is my war. I think I pass, I'm afraid, completely on the idea that the General Assembly, under the leadership of the Secretary General, could, yes, in a sense, completely transform the practical circumstances by anything they could do. I mean, it would be very wonderful if they did, but I would say it would be probably a political miracle if they did. And I don't think they show much signs of being in a miraculous phase at the moment, so I would be just surprised if that happened. But I don't, I have nothing against that if it occurs. I just don't think it's going to occur. The way I think about this question is I think you could have a normative standard for an acceptable peace at the end of this war, and on that I think my judgment overlaps very considerably with what both of you have said. I mean, the bit which is perfectly compatible in what you both said, which is that there must be an outcome in which what is definitely an unjust war is not rewarding to the aggressor. I mean, that just must be right. That must be the normative standard. And of course, that's a very, very demanding standard in these circumstances, because the aggressing power has done so much damage, and because the aggressing power is much more heavily armed even now than the victim power, and because I think the distinction between the people of Russia and Putin is a distinction which is actually politically inapplicable at the present. I mean, I fully accept the normative force of that. I wish no ill to anyone because they are Russian. But it is unfortunately the case that quite a large proportion of the Russian population whose opinions have been ascertained in a reasonably reliable way, or sometimes very directly by asking them in front of a camera on the street, have actually espoused the war. And of course I believe that they've espoused the war because they have, in many cases, because they have very little idea of what happened. But they have been very drastically befuddled by the way that Putin has governed Russia increasingly over the last 10 years. They have no access to a reasonably accurate picture of the external world. Well, it's very hard to act if you have no idea what is going on. I mean, you can't act effectively. I don't think the people of Russia have political agency at the moment, I'm afraid. And political agency is definitely going to be required if there is going to be a peace process which terminates in peace. I mean, there can be a quest for peace from many, many different angles, and all of them might have quite good justifications as quests. But it doesn't really matter what quests are in process unless there's some prospect of their actually reaching their intended outcome, their finding what they're looking for. So I think that the normative standard is not very difficult to see the shape of. I mean, you can talk about the weight of different bits of it, but I think it is pretty clear because this is a completely unjustifiable and inexcusable and appalling thing to have done. And I also very much agree with Mona that it's clear it was Putin that did this. It wasn't Russia that did this. But unfortunately, insofar as Russia is audible, it's not shown any effective sign of opposition to it. There have been a few Russian diplomats who've essentially resigned because of the horror of what has been done. And there have been some very distinguished Russian ex-diplomats who've effectively denounced what's been done. But it appears from such evidence as there is that there is definitely majority support on the basis of the crazed picture that has been distributed by Putin for what is happening. So I don't really feel that the people of Russia are an agent in this, and I doubt if whatever happens through the processes of the UN General Assembly and a braver and more, honourable interpretation of what the Charter requires, actually. I agree with you about that. I don't think that will sort of get through to the people of Russia and turn them into an agent. I don't see how that can happen. I also think there's no chance whatever of Putin accepting a ceasefire, still less, as it were, a withdrawal to the initial line, certainly a withdrawal to the initial line before 2014, but I think actually the initial line now. In February this year. I think the only circumstances in which Russia will in fact, let's say Putin, just to keep it as clear as possible, will actually stop is if he's in fact stopped. And I think that can only be a military process. I don't think there's any other process which could do it, and I think that won't happen unless much more, I'm afraid, aggressive weapons are given to the Ukrainian army. it might be able to stop, well, obviously it depends on how far up the scale you go, but I think it might be able to stop and to reverse, I mean, this particular Russian forward movement, I mean, if it was given the right sorts of weapons. But I don't think anything else will have that consequence, and it isn't being given those sorts of weapons so far. And I think that was a terrible mistake, I'm afraid, on the part of NATO as a military alliance, and of the European Union and the United States of America and my own, at this moment, wretched country. Not the only time it's been a wretched country, we could agree about that. But I think that it's been a mistake, a really serious mistake of statecraft and failure in, I would say, I mean, humanitarian purpose, not to have armed Ukraine more effectively quite a lot sooner. So I'm afraid I take a very bleak view of the position. If, in fact, Russia was effectively militarily defeated, then I think all the processes which Mona has outlined might very felicitously be put in operation. Now, there's nothing to be said against, normatively or, I take it, legally, against any of them. Well, of course, there's always things to be said against anything from a legal point of view, but I mean, the things to be said against, I'm sure, would lose. But I don't think that they are practically pertinent, I'm afraid, and I don't think they will become practically pertinent unless the war really goes against Russia. And I don't think that can happen except militarily. I don't think there's any way in which it could occur except militarily. So it's a very bleak position. And of course I agree very much with Professor Baumann that I mean, Russia is, economically speaking, winning for a bit. I mean, and for much too long for it to be acceptable to think about it in that time structure. So I'm afraid I'm rather a warmonger from that point of view in this context. I just think this is a most terrible war. I think this is actually, in consequential terms, again for the reasons that Professor Baumann gave me, I think this is the first real world war, because it's wrecking the human future. It's absolutely catastrophic at a global level. And I think it's, well, I had to give a talk last night at the Institute about how I saw the war, and I think it is the most disastrous thing which has happened in the world for a very long time, and I don't see a way out of it except by the failure of the aggression, essentially. So I haven't been a warmonger earlier in life. It's a new identity. But then also, this is a time in which I was likelier to be one, because it is my war, as I've said.
John, thank you very much. And there are a lot of ideas now on the table already, so I'm gonna skip my discussion round. I'm gonna hand over straight away to you, and also those who join us online. And I anticipate that there will be quite a few questions, so always gonna do 3 at a time. Yeah, and then maybe we're gonna go first row, and then perhaps briefly identify yourself, first row. Briefly identify yourself and then ask your question.
Thank you very much. My name is Dr. Rathor. My first question to Franz Baumann. Thank you for a very comprehensive, informative information. And my question is that we have experience in the history, but I don't go back to the history. Also, coming from the UN, and we have seen that invasion of Iraq 2003. Nothing happened. There was the Security Council. There was no Security Council resolution, and yet it happened. This was an example. 2014 invasion of Donbass, very slight sanctions have been imposed. So if you have the example of that, and I don't want to justify the invasion or occupation, because we are victim of that, but what we see is that there is an example and there is a precedent's cases and nothing happened. So what really will happen here in 2022 will be an example further in future for any invasion for any other country. So therefore, probably concrete steps should be taken here that such an invasion or occupation should be stopped. If you allow me another question to Mona, you talk a lot about the resolutions passed by the General Assembly, which was not vetoed, and you number of them. I was also part of a lot of UN peacekeeping missions, and so I have seen that all those resolutions did not materialize. I mean, whether they were in Kashmir, coming in Palestine, and go, but the stronger countries were able to impose that, but not the weaker countries. So how will you make sure that it will happen in Russian case? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Daniel Gombosch. I'm a second semester sinology student at the University of Vienna. And I wanted to ask Mr. Dunn, if you see the war expanding in any way, if you say that it becomes a world war, how does it expand? Where does it expand?
Well, I think it's expanding consequentially already. I think it's going to starve enormous numbers of people. I mean, that is a world war. I started thinking about, potential ends to the war when I was asked to talk this month at the second China Global Forum. And I had to say to my potential hosts and hostesses that I couldn't, because what I would say would be something they could not show in the People's Republic at this point. But my argument is certainly that it's massively against the interests of the Chinese people the Chinese people over any possible time horizon, but actually it's massively against the interests of the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party to join in this war. What they should do is to tell Putin that although they certainly intend to recapture what they think of as their own territory offshore, and they would be happy to be supported in doing so. Actually, they are not up for attacking the territory of people which are independent states. They are against it, and they are supposed to be against it. They're officially against it. Anyway, but they should take that seriously, and they should recognize that actually it is essential to stop this war fast and decisively. I mean, the thing about peace is it's no use having peace if it's just a set of words in a document, whoever has put their signature to it. There isn't such a thing as peace unless it can be kept. And against the second most powerful, perhaps it isn't any longer the second, in some ways it is, obviously, most powerful military power in the world, I mean, it's not so easy to see how it can be kept. It just is not. So I would argue very hard with any Chinese persons I could get within earshot that that's the right way for China to see it. And actually, I think there's a big interest from China in the longer term in being an evidently responsible global actor, and I think that would enable them to develop something which they're very keen on developing, which is flattering contrasts between themselves and the record of the United States of America over the last 20 years or so. And, with Britain sometimes sort of, tagging along, more or less discreditably, well, very discreditably. So you know, I think it's a Chinese war too, but not. But I think they need to get on the right side of it, and certainly they need to get off the wrong side of it.
Let's continue to gather questions, and then I'm going to hand over the word to the panelists. Yes.
My name is Andreas Grassel. I'm doing geopolitics videos on TikTok, but not mainly, but that's also, I think, relevant. I was quite shocked to hear the first statement, and I want to comment and then also get a question in for Mr. Baumann. That so many people here think it's a good idea to first call on Russia getting a humiliating defeat as a kind of condition to make peace afterwards. I think it's at least not my opinion, and I thought calling back on Mr. Milov of the Russian opposition that visited the Diplomatic Academy just last week, I picked up on a statement of him, and he said Putin is always happy to broker a deal. He's a deal maker. He doesn't like the law, and he doesn't respect the law, and whenever a deal can be brokered, he's very much in favor of it, which of course is kind of the Kissinger way of saying, well, give him a bargain, and which would be obviously not the thing you want to do. But picking up on that one, I think if a peace is going to be brokered, there needs to be someone who'd guarantee it. It's very much the statement you've given. What about China? Can China step up as it is a force that is respected by Ukraine and Russia, which the United States at the moment are not? Can they step up and guarantee the peace process in eastern Ukraine? That's for you. Thank you.
Okay, so this is my second question on the list. Who wants? Yes.
Okay, I will stand up. I'm Valerie. I'm also from Odessa. As you said that you have roots from there. I'm a located lawyer from Ukraine, and thank you, Austria, so much that actually you are greeting refugees so much. Really appreciate. And for now, I guess I have one question for Mr. Baumann about actually entering Ukraine for NATO. I guess that for now Ukraine actually don't need it for now because as Sweden example and Finland as well shows that actually Turkey can just make NATO and that wouldn't work. And also I really guess that I need to a little bit to make a big point about that good Russians for now are really a big problem because we now see that they are not exist. Because just like all of them are actually thinking about what will be next, how they will save their reputations. And I have relatives from Russia, a lot of my friends have relatives of Russia, and actually all of them really wish us die. And it's actually the biggest problem for all of us because we lost families on that side, and we think that like a lot of Ukrainians really think that without help of European Union, without help of US, actually we will the idea of being Ukrainians will be collapsed. And I think that actually like soft diplomacy completely doesn't work. What other ideas, except actually providing heavy weapons from US, will help, in your opinion? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm even going to continue two more. I'll do blocks of 5 questions. Third row, yeah.
Okay, my name is Machimbala. I'm a MI2 student at the Diplomatic Academie Vienna. I have a question that goes to Professor Franz Baumann. Regarding the methods used to solve the crisis in Ukraine. I have the impression that the only method that's being used, or that has been used so far, is implementing sanctions against Russia. And I think that these sanctions are neither utilitarian nor beneficial to the rest of the world. Because you mentioned that these sanctions have no real effects on Ukraine, But do you make this statement from a Western perspective? Because as an African, I can confirm that these sanctions have very disastrous effects against other regions, and prices of foods are skyrocketing in Africa, for instance. We are suffering from these sanctions, not Russia, but other parts of the world. Is the crisis only about the West, or does the West also think about the rest of the world when these kind of sanctions are being implemented? Thank you so much.
Thank you. And then we'll do one more in that group. I'm going to continue with this side, and then I'm going to switch over to you. Yes.
Sorry. Hello. My name is Alexandra. I'm a student here. I was wondering, you all underlined the fact that Russia is not Putin, but still, when we talk about the end of the war and the peace plan, the whole Russia will be accountable for the atrocities. How could this problem be tackled? If we acknowledge already that Russia is not Putin, how could a peace plan be constructed around this problem?
Thank you. And now I'll finally hand over. And I think we're going to start with Franz, and then we're going to go over Mona and then John.
Thank you. Very interesting question. So we will take a break at midnight and then we'll come back. Yeah. So Afsar, your question is very interesting about the president of 2003 and Iraq and now. It is true that the world looks very different from wherever you sit. And I was in the middle of it at the UN in 2003. I was there in 2001, 9/11, and I saw this shock in America that bred some irrationality. And I'm not defending it, I'm just painting the mood. And while there were voices to say that Iraq had nothing to do with this attack, there was such a feverish atmosphere that one can simply not discount. Also, the Security Council passed 18 resolutions. It was seized by the matter quite intensively, and there were widespread discussions. And so now, I don't see the parallel so much to Ukraine right now, February or December, massing of troops, of coming with a story that NATO was encroaching on Russia, an absolutely idiotic idea. The last eastward expansion of NATO was in 2004. That's 18 years ago. As if Lithuania or Latvia or Estonia had any intent on attacking Russia. No, we were happy to buy the fossil fuels and to sell the cars. Nobody wanted to. Russia feeling threatened was completely harebrained. I agree, Saddam threatening America was equally harebrained too. But attacking a neighbor, and you mentioned of a brother nation with the same language, with families going back and forth, I think there are some differences. I would have wished for the UN Secretary General in early February, when he was in Beijing for the opening of the Olympics, in the same stadium with Xi Jinping and with Putin, to bring them together and say, please guarantee me that you're not going to start this war. Shame him into this. So he didn't do this. I find also egregious, Ukraine, after the Soviet Union collapsed, gave up its nuclear weapons, and its territorial integrity, which was guaranteed anyway by the UN Charter, was reconfirmed solemnly in the Budapest Agreement in 1995. So there are some elements, and also the viciousness of the war, shelling civilian targets, which I don't think has a parallel in other wars of recent time, makes this particularly egregious. I much agree with you, John, about the sad fact that Russian people at the moment have no political agency because it is a dictatorship. From what I read, I think a high percentage of the Russian people actually support the war, which is terrible. It doesn't surprise me. No polls were taken in Germany in 1943, 44, but if they were, I don't think that the regime would have been supported by less than 70%, including here. And so the bombing of the cities in Germany, not Vienna because it was too far for Allied bombers to reach and go back home, there were banners with a swastika on it saying our walls broke, but not our hearts. The bombing of cities, Hamburg, Frankfurt, Dresden, strengthened the regime. So this is just, I say this as a matter of fact. Yeah, on the sanctions. Now, by the way, let me go to this thing. I'm not arguing for humiliating Russia. I am saying that there are some people, like Macron or like Kissinger, saying we should not humiliate Russia. And my point is, in the situation where Putin and the Russian people, I think, are quite together, for many reasons one can deplore, but it's simply a matter of fact, sparing their feelings, or even saying, this is Russia is not Putin. No, I think the Russian people, there is a Russian war. Putin has made it a Russian war, and it's not up to us to say who is against it and who is not. We can see how many people are fleeing, but it is exactly like World War II was a German war, even though afterwards we said it was all Hitler, we didn't know anything about it. No, it was a German war, and what we're seeing that it is a Russian war. And I'm a conscientious objector. I did not want to serve in the German army for reasons having to do with we should not attack Russia or we did terrible things there, so politically motivated. So I find myself in an awkward situation, coming around to the point that John was making also, that the only solution I see is actually a military defeat of Russia in the sense that it has to be thrown out of Ukraine. Not to go further and regime change in Moscow, hopefully that will come too, but that what Russia has illegally taken cannot stand. And if that requires telling the Russians that they're humiliated, so be it. If I said the sanctions were not working, the sanctions are strengthening Russia economically at the moment. And back to the Russian political agency, I think Russian people say, I say this, my father was a Russian teacher and my sister too, so some connections. We've suffered enough, we can go through this. So they built up this external enemy kind of thing, and the regime might actually get strengthened. I regret it. What the West did not do is kick the addiction to fossil fuels, like this country here. Germany, in 2009, we imported 30% of gas from Russia. Last year, it was 66%. So it shot up after the invasion of Crimea. So we are a drug addict, and Putin is the seller of the drugs. And so now we say we will go off not 3 joints a day, but 2, and then maybe 1, but we're not kicking the addiction because we fear, we don't see seriously, John, that we're in World War III. We still think we can continue business as usual, not even a speed limit on the Autobahn. Nobody wants to say that we're in a war. We are in a war situation, whether we like it or not. And so it has to be treated like a war, not just having the Ukrainians die for us, but that we in the West should be as committed to making sure that the military effort of Russia, aggression, does not pay. So let me stop here. I could say more, but maybe in the next round.
Mona.
Hi. The two of you terrify me. The only thing less realistic than a peace talk and a peace process is a military defeat of Russia. Because, as we said earlier, modern wars are not won. Not a single modern war has been won. The US couldn't win in Vietnam. The US couldn't win in Iraq. Russia and the US could not win in Afghanistan. So what makes you think there's a military defeat on the horizon? More importantly, are the Ukrainian civilians going to be less trampled under the feet of the Russian army when there's American, NATO, and Russian weapons raining down on them? I don't see how that's better for the protection of the civilians in Ukraine. I don't see Russia willing to be defeated. They have nuclear arsenals that will come into play if they feel that they do not have an exit ramp, that they do not have advantage at the peace table. So be very careful when you leave no option for a peace talk, for a peaceful resolution of the conflict. Now, when we talk about the Russian public, let's not forget the American public re-elected Bush after the war in Iraq. So an overwhelming majority may be, because of the misinformation they're being fed, because of nationalists rallying around the leader, may be in favor of the war, to the extent that they have information about what the war is actually doing to their country. Because economics takes time. Economic sanctions take time. 3 months is really nothing. It's a blip on the screen when you have multiple reserves because of the oil sales that have been going on and on almost daily since the war even began. It's only now that they're talking about an oil embargo. Now, economic sanctions alone will not work, but they will create some impact. The reputational damage, the political isolation, where there are peace talks going on in Turkey right now. There are peace proposals being made, as was being made before the invasion. Turkey is a plausible convener of such peace talks. The fact that they have objected to Sweden and Finland joining NATO could be a bargaining chip. That if there is a non-aggression pact against Finland and Sweden, that there may be a need to possibly suspend the application. Not remove it, because that's their sovereign right, but to suspend it. That creates a bargaining chip. That creates some leverage, some incentive to pull back. China, I don't think, has stepped up to the way Putin thought they would step up. This war is about saving ethnic minorities in Ukraine, according to Putin's narrative. China doesn't want foreign interference crossing its borders to help the ethnic minorities that it is harming in its own territory. It's not in China's advantage, as you said, albeit for a slightly different reason, to endorse Russia's war in Ukraine, because that would mean it's okay to cross international borders to help ethnic minorities. That means people can cross China's border to help the Uyghurs, to help the Tibetans, to help countless other ethnic minorities whose human rights are being violated in China. So that's not a message that China wants to endorse. Now, it already has universal recognition of the One China policy and that Taiwan is a province of China. It has nothing to gain by militarily occupying it, especially when the consequence of doing so is quite evident. So I agree with you that China can play a credible, possibly even with the US, as a possible creating incentives for Russia to move away from this aggressive and self-destructive policy. The other point is the Russian public. Given the maximum sentences that are being imposed, the threats and intimidation that are being imposed on the Russian people who dare speak up against the war, and it may be a minority, the fact that any of them are demonstrating, much less thousands, the fact that they're chanting against the war in public fora, the fact that newscasters are walking off and making public statements, the fact that journalists are making statements, the fact that representatives are resigning in public protest. This must be devastating, considering how much control there is, how much control over the narrative there is. So there are cracks in the facade of the unity that can be recognized. Now, to the important question that was posed to me, success and failure. Many Security Council resolutions have also yet to be implemented. Many General Assembly resolutions, including emergency special sessions, did not. But what they can do is create what Professor Dunn has called the normative standard, that there is a normative standard. If we show respect for what should be, then maybe we can show what can be. And my proposal isn't what the GA is doing or will be doing, but what it can do. If the political will is found, and we saw that the General Assembly was able to act much faster than the Security Council in the Ebola crisis. They were able to rally around international vaccine. They were able to rally around WHO assistance across the globe. They did provide a normative framework and coordinate the UN response much faster than the Security Council did. So we can look to them. I'm not saying they will step up, but they can step up. And we shouldn't give them a pass and say they can't do anything, because that just gives them all the more reason not to try. Last but not least, I do believe that war has failed. So that doesn't mean that something might not succeed, doesn't mean it's not worth trying. So we should always believe in the rule of law. Last but not least, the lady who was concerned about Russia paying the price for Putin's crimes, the beauty of the law is that criminal accountability is individual. It is not collective. So those who commit crimes, whether it's the Russian soldier, the Ukrainian soldier, the Russian head of state, they individually will be held accountable. And as far as the reparations to be paid, Putin himself, Lavrov himself, the oligarchs have stolen enough money from the Russian people to pay for the reparations in Ukraine. Nothing further has to be stolen from the Russian people. So I think it can be done without further loss on either side. Thanks.
Thank you, Mona. John.
So I think that it would be, communicatively, it would be a beneficial thing to do, just at the imaginary level, to sketch out what a just outcome could be. So I don't disagree with anything that Mona has said. But I don't think that I don't think it is a good idea to think about the ideal at a time when something absolutely terrible is occurring and the practical imperative is to stop it. I don't think it's a substitute. I don't think it can be a substitute for actually stopping it. And I think it's out of the question for Ukraine to defeat Russia militarily over the territory of Russia, which is very large. But I don't think it is out of the question for Ukraine to defeat Russia actually within the territorial boundaries of Ukraine. I'm possibly not including the Crimea. That would be rather ambitious, I think, militarily. But I think there's no reason why, in principle, the Russian invasion can't be repulsed. And I don't myself believe that unless, in fact, the present Russian regime is brought down, I don't believe that the criminals will be accountable. I mean, accountability is not just an idea, it's an experience, it's an outcome. I don't see any possibility of the outcome. I mean, it isn't as though international criminal prosecution has been a tremendous cumulative success since it's been seriously undertaken. There obviously is quite a lot of room for dispute about how just the Nuremberg process was. But it's absolutely clear that what made the Nuremberg process possible was the complete defeat of the Third Reich. I don't see that if the persons who would be accountable, this is the gap between the normative standard and what to do, or what to try to do anyway. I think it's too soon for a normative standard to help in this particular context. Apart from anything else, what is so clear about the present context is that actually what the Russian regime has done is absolutely indefensible normatively. I mean, there could not be anything which a regime could do which is more evidently and profoundly unjust and barbarous. And I just think you don't want to get away too fast from the imperative of stopping it. And I do believe, actually, it probably is possible to stop it if the Ukrainian armed forces are armed adequately. I don't think that what will be there afterwards is peace, but I think it might be a context in which the idea of at least pursuing a peace settlement would become realistic. And it certainly is true that if there was to be a peace settlement, the most important component of it would have to be the guarantees for it? What made it actually predictably and reliably effective through the future? And I don't see how that could happen without a military defeat of Russia. I do not see how it's possible that that could occur without a military defeat of Russia.
Thank you. Let's do one more round, but very quickly, because obviously we're running out of time. Who still wants to ask questions? That's then we'll do that. 1, 2, 3, 4. Luca.
Thank you, Luca Bacher. I'm a student here. Thank you for your discussion, and most of all, I think you shared your thoughts so far. We heard little about the peace plan you were supposed to talk about. Hopefully it doesn't come to an all-out war which would end only with aggression. We need the peace plan. We need it as soon as possible. But as soon as possible is not an answer to the timeline. So can you please maybe elaborate a bit more on what you mean exactly when you speak about peacekeeping operations being deployed in the region? When? Who? When? And the other measures following this. We need exact, close to exact tempo politics on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Then the hands up, because
Good evening, everyone. My name is Cameron Dodo, MICE 2. I have a question to Franz Baumann and reflection on John Dunn. You have mentioned about NATO, and we understood that NATO is obviously a dream. However, we haven't talked about the EU. How possible is the idea that Ukraine is going to become a member of the European Union? Is actually the European Union mature enough to take further problems in the Union, knowing the fact that we have eternal issues already? So having known that the foreign minister Schallenberg of Austria blocks Ukraine for entering to the European Union. So the alternative version of Macron creating second European forum, does it mean that the enlargement of the European Union is going to come to the end? Thank you about that. And to John Dunn, I like the idea, and I'm thankful that you shared about that the World War I has come here. However, I would like to agree to disagree in this case. It seems that the World War I has come in 2004, 2007, 2011, 14, 15, and now. The question is why we haven't learned. It seems that the tactics in Donbass are nothing new. The ethnic destabilization, nothing new. So therefore, it seems to me that the World War I has been already here. We were just too slow to see it. Thank you.
Thank you. We have one more question, Shamin, and second, yeah.
Thank you. My name is Shamil Kazbek. I'm a student of MICE 2, and I wanted to ask, obviously it is true that Putin does not represent views of Russians. Most Russians might agree with them, but it's their political opinion, and sometimes it is heartbreaking because some of them are my relatives. But also those few who actually do protest and who actually go out and have courage to oppose their leader, they deserve praise, especially considering that a leader of opposition was recently is about to be sentenced for another 15 years. Of course, I am speaking of Alexei Navalny. But I wanted to ask, saying that Putin is not part of Russia, saying that basically excluding him from the conversation, he is still the leader of Russia, and with recent constitutional amendments that he made, he will be the leader of Russia until 2036. And we need to have something done now. So I don't think that excluding Putin from picture, even though most of us would like to see him probably obviously to stop fire and to be responsible for all the crimes. But I don't think that excluding him from picture is actually will bring peace any closer to us. And how do we negotiate with Putin? Because we have to, he's a considered part of Russia. He is now the leader of Russia, and the whole regime is revolving around his persona. So yes, so my question basically, we have a dictator running Russia, and the only way to achieve any further advancements in peace is to negotiate with this dictator. So I wanted to ask you, dear professors, what leverages United Nations has, what leverages NATO has, what leverages the EU has to negotiate with him and to bring peace sooner than in 2036, because by then it will be obviously it will be too late. Thank you.
So thank you. So Europe and stability, that's also something that we have on the online question. So there's also one question, for instance, what should Europe do in order to re-establish long-term stability and sustainable peace? Let me plead with you, because we've been it's been a while already. So maybe 2 minutes. Responding to the questions and a concluding statement. I know that's a lot to ask, but give it a try.
Okay, let me talk very quickly. I think we have talked about a peace plan, we have talked about the elements of a peace plan, and even the mechanisms. We did not assess the chances, how that will happen. But I think it is very important for the West, for NATO and for EU, and this is also to answer your question that you had earlier. What currently is being provided is not just the sanctions, but you also have the military supplies, you have the intelligence support, you have the budgetary support of Ukraine, and you have slowing down buying fossil fuels from Russia, not blockading it, but buying. So this is a package, and if that were amplified and strengthened, it could actually make a bit different. So Putin is playing the long game because economically he thinks he's winning it and he will prevail because the West cannot stick together so long, and so he's playing for time, and the West has to make sure that he miscalculates. So Russian people have to be given a perspective like German people after World War II, not collective guilt, personal guilt, Nuremberg trials, but soon integration back into the community of civilized nations. Could have been done better, but it was so important to give people a perspective. I think currently Russians are on Putin's side, but they have to be told, you are backing a loser. Whether that will work or not, I do not know. Now, I do not know, European Union is a very special animal with very special requirements. I would, categorically, I think Ukraine should not be in NATO, simply so not to provoke the Russians and whatever. There have to be security guarantees, because you know, it is not that NATO moved eastward, it moved that countries moved westward. And so Ukraine has to be given very hard guarantee, and I personally would love it to be in the EU. Whether it meets all the requirements, and Turkey and I do not know. But I think there can be mechanisms short of actual membership to make sure that a pacified Ukraine will flourish economically, will be in the supply chain, visa-free travel. So if Ukraine throws out the invaders with Western help, a new chapter can open. That might also signal to Russia, look what you have done. You have lost the war in misery, and maybe that will bring about the internal change that I meant, that Russia has to change before it can be readmitted to the Society of Nations. Thank you.
Una.
So several points microphone, sorry. Several points to address in 2 minutes. Those who are advocating for a more aggressive turn of events on the part of NATO and US support to Ukraine need to remember that by providing non-defensive weapons, they will trigger potentially that the US and NATO become a party to the conflict. That is not in anybody's interest. And if there's going to be a rallying around the national leader in Russia, that's more likely to occur if they feel that they're fighting NATO as opposed to fighting Ukraine. So that isn't necessarily a recipe for ending the war. It could actually escalate the war. There is also very, very strong desire to look at the consequences across the globe. The Ukrainian civilians are suffering, but what they're suffering may be at a much larger scale, but the indignities and the vagaries of violence are being also experienced by other peoples around the world. We should not forget that. We should not forget what the Darfuris are suffering, or what the Rohingyas are suffering, or what the Uyghurs are suffering, or what the multiple intrastate conflicts in Africa, those civilians are also suffering. So the protection of civilians has to be a unifying principle. Whether the war between combatants continues, the need to re-enshrine the sanctity of civilian life, the unacceptability of targeting civilian buildings, civilian population centers, that must be immediately invoked by the Security Council, by the General Assembly, by all people of good conscience, whether it's NATO or the EU or China. The leverage can be found in the fact that there is, I believe, a military retreat. The grandiose calculation of a 3-day blitzkrieg that would defeat the Ukrainian leadership was shown to be absolutely delusional. They not only survived the blitzkrieg, they resisted it rather successfully because of the military support that they were given, the intelligence support they were given, and what is now accruing to be $50 billion of support. So that is already the retreat and the focus now, the strategic focus on the Donbass region and those areas in the east and the southeast is precisely where they already were, where they already had de facto control. So they need to, we need to be realistic as to the fact that certain military success has already been achieved, and that escalating the war isn't necessarily the solution, that giving them the means to defend themselves so valiantly has had an impact. The timeline for a peacekeeping mission, I would imagine that if there is appetite for it, we need an immediate demand for the protection of civilians, the responsibility to protect the civilians, to refrain from any actions that are targeting civilians. The cessation of hostilities can be something, I mean, I'd like to see 3 months. If you're asking me, you cannot have a deployment of a peacekeeping mission until you have a cessation of hostilities, because otherwise there is no peace to keep, and otherwise you're sending, people from other countries to die in the crossfire. So what you need, I think, maximum 2 to 3 months for a cessation of hostilities, which, if the international community can bring up the will, and I think we will shortly be seeing impact from the sanctions. Expectations are that by July, August, the impact will be felt. That there is room to hope that a peace plan can start gaining momentum by September. That might be optimistic, but I'd rather be optimistic than pessimistic, and certainly nihilistic is not an option. Last but not least, Putin has already miscalculated. He miscalculated the EU's response, NATO's response, the United States response, the Chinese response, the Ukrainian response, as well as the leadership of Zelensky himself. He practically humiliated his entire cabinet in front of the whole international community on the eve of the war because of his certainty and his greed in claiming credit for this war that had yet to be fought, that has certainly not panned out the way that he thought. We're not talking about excluding Putin. We're talking about not conflating Putin with the entire nation and people of Russia. Those are two very different things. Obviously, as the head of state of the government concerned, for the foreseeable future, he will, of course, have something to say. But we need to make it easier for those who are advising him to show him that there is a path, an incentive to stop fighting. And the sooner we do that, the better for the Ukrainian people.
John, thank you.
Yes, well, I'm afraid I don't agree about the sooner the better for the Ukrainian people, because I think that would in practice mean, to quite a considerable degree, a military victory for Putin at the moment. And I mean, 2 months might be enough for him to take quite a lot more of Ukraine. In fact, it is very important to understand that this war has been escalated already. If you watch a Russian television program, all of which, except when one brave woman I mean, incredibly brave woman, I mean, appears and puts up a placard. But if you watch any other Russian television program, it is said incessantly and with great glee, we are at war with NATO. So that's happened already. It's not some possible future eventuality in the mind of the Russian leadership and in their public discourse. It's very loud, their public discourse. And and also it is very extreme, I think, I mean, on the sort of denazification front. I mean, why have they put on their helicopters and their tanks the sign which was actually the sign of the Third Reich? I mean, why have they done that? That is a pretty odd thing to do if what you're doing is denazifying a country. I think that I simply feel it's unreal to think that there could be any process of real accountability which doesn't involve Putin stopping being the leader of Russia. And I think from that point of view, the military defeat may be the only possible way of saving the Russian people in the medium term. I don't think they can be saved now by anything anyone could do. But I think it could actually really weaken the regime, which is very peculiarly constructed in Russia at the moment, and which hasn't done a great deal for the people it's ruling for quite a long time, and is certainly not doing anything for them now. So I think that Russian regime would be, to a significant degree, practically delegitimated if it was militarily defeated. I don't have a sort of crazy picture of the Ukrainian army storming through to Moscow. That's not the way I'm thinking about it at all. And I think it's very unlikely that there could be a peace, whoever guaranteed it. And they'd have to guarantee it in a more reliable way than they did in 1994. I mean, Russia is a guarantor of the security of Ukraine under the Budapest Memorandum, and so is the United States. Well, maybe the United States has woken up to that thought very recently, a bit. But I mean, Russia is a guarantor of the security of Ukraine. I mean, how can the security of Ukraine be guaranteed unless there is something substantial enough between it and the armed might of Russia?
John, thank you. Thanks a lot to all the panelists. And you saw that there is controversies, no question about the topic. And stay tuned. I think there'll be more of these events here because there clearly is need to talk about probably also more of the details of how a peace plan could look like. And we're gonna go now next door, and thanks to the Austrian Research Association, we can do a little reception, and then please feel free to continue the discussion informally. And before you do that, please join me in a round of applause for the panelists. Thanks so much.